Past 130 pounds per square inch, the air tanks detonated. This is the autopsy of the 10 most violent pneumatic reservoir ruptures in railroad history. To stop 15,000 tons of freight, a modern diesel locomotive relies on massive steel air tanks slung right under the cab. These main reservoirs pack thousands of cubic feet of air, compressed to 130 pounds per square inch. It is enough stored kinetic energy to crush a car. But the air inside hides a silent killer: moisture. When water mixes with high pressure, it eats the steel from the inside out. The crew cannot see the rot. The tank looks perfectly fine on the outside. But when the weakened steel finally gives up, the tank does not just leak, it detonates like a massive pipe bomb. The blast turns thick iron into flying shrapnel and instantly severs the brake lines. How does invisible rust turn a safety device into an unguided bomb? And what happens to the crew when the floor literally explodes beneath their feet? Pressure begins its climb the moment the locomotive's compressor governor cuts in at 90 pounds per square inch. This is the first surge. The main reservoir, a 200-gallon steel cylinder bolted beneath the crew cab, starts to fill with compressed air. At 90 pounds per square inch, the tank already contains about 1.2 megajoules of stored energy. That is the kinetic equivalent of dropping a small car from the roof of a building. The governor acts as a mechanical sentinel, spring-loaded, diaphragm-controlled, and calibrated to open the compressor intake at exactly 90 pounds per square inch. Every time the brake pipe system draws down, the governor snaps the circuit closed and the compressor hammers back to life. Each pulse injects more atmosphere into the steel balloon, raising internal pressure and forcing the wall to stretch microscopically. The numbers are not abstract. A 200-gallon main reservoir at 90 pounds per square inch holds enough potential energy to drive a steel rod through a concrete wall. The tank's wall thickness, typically 7 millimeters of ASTMA 36 carbon steel, is selected to withstand the hoop stress generated at this pressure. The calculation is simple. Hoop stress equals pressure times diameter divided by twice the wall thickness. At 90 pounds per square inch, the steel is well within its yield strength. But the margin is not infinite. Every cycle, every recharge, is a test of the material's integrity. Inside the tank, the compressed air is invisible. The crew above feels nothing but the steady throb of the compressor and the faint hiss of the charging line. Yet the main reservoir is now a loaded device, armed with more than 1 million joules of stored work. The governor's low set point is not a safety feature. It is a minimum threshold. Below 90 pounds per square inch, the brakes will not respond as designed. Above it, the steel balloon grows tighter, closer to its design ceiling. The climb from 90 to 130 pounds per square inch is not just a number. It is the difference between controlled energy and the edge of catastrophic failure. The climb stops at 130 pounds per square inch. Every locomotive main reservoir is governed to this hard ceiling. The compressor cuts out, the pressure gauge freezes. At this moment, the steel balloon under the cab holds 2.2 megajoules of stored energy, enough to drive a steel rod through a concrete wall or crush a mid-sized car in a single pulse. The wall thickness, always at least 7 millimeters for 130 pounds per square inch service, is not a luxury. It is a survival requirement. If the wall thins below that threshold, the next pressure cycle could force the steel past its yield strength. There is no warning, no gradual leak. The reservoir transitions from containment to catastrophic failure in milliseconds. The 130 pounds per square inch ceiling is not a suggestion. It is the dividing line between controlled storage and pneumatic detonation. The main reservoir is not a passive tank. It is a loaded device charged to the same energy as a demolition charge, held in check only by the integrity of its steel shell. When the governor cuts out at full load, every square inch of the reservoir wall is under siege. The hoop stress calculation is simple. Internal pressure times diameter divided by twice the remaining wall thickness. At 130 pounds per square inch, a 7 millimeter wall keeps the stress below the steel's yield point. Any loss, by corrosion, pitting, or unnoticed mechanical damage, moves the system closer to failure. This is not combustion. There is no fire here. When a diesel tank ruptures, it burns. When a main reservoir ruptures, it detonates. The shock wave is pure physics, compressed air expanding, steel fragmenting, lethal force unleashed in a single, silent heartbeat. The ceiling at 130 pounds per square inch is absolute. The only margin is the thickness of the steel between stored energy and disaster. Compressed air is never dry. Every intake stroke of the locomotive's compressor pulls in atmosphere loaded with invisible water vapor. As the air is forced from ambient pressure to 130 pounds per square inch, its temperature spikes, sometimes climbing from 30 to 70 degrees Celsius in seconds. The hot charge enters the main reservoir, but the steel shell is colder. The temperature gradient is brutal. As the air cools inside the tank, it drops below its dew point. Water vapor condenses out, forming droplets that collect on the interior walls. This is not a minor side effect. For every 1,000 cubic feet per minute pushed into the reservoir, up to 150 milliliters of water can be wrung from the air. Over a shift, this adds up to a persistent film of condensate along the tank's lowest point. The physics are inescapable. Dew point mechanics guarantee that any time compressed air cools, water will appear. The main reservoir's geometry ensures that this water pools at the bottom, right where hoop stress is highest. The steel is never dry. A thin, nearly invisible film of water becomes a standing threat, soaking the inner surface day after day. This is the root cause of every corrosion failure in the record. No air dryer or drain valve can remove all of it. The moment the compressor cuts out and the tank cools, the cycle repeats. The water is not inert. It does not just sit. It dissolves oxygen and salts from the atmosphere, creating a corrosive electrolyte. The film seeps into microscopic scratches and weld seams, starting the first stage of pit formation. Over time, these pits grow deeper, eating away at the minimum wall thickness required to contain 130 pounds per square inch. The crew above never sees it. The pressure gauge reads steady. But inside, the steel balloon is being silently sabotaged by its own condensate. The next section will track how these pits become the fracture origins for catastrophic pneumatic detonation. Pitting corrosion does not attack the main reservoir wall evenly. It strikes in isolated, microscopic craters, each a stress concentrator, each a silent breach in the steel's defensive line. A single pit, measuring just 2 millimeters deep in a 7 millimeter wall, can triple the local hoop stress. This is not a uniform loss. The rest of the reservoir may retain its original thickness, but the pit becomes the weak link. The pressure inside does not care about averages. It finds the thinnest spot and applies maximum force at that point, cycle after cycle, until the steel yields. Technical sidebar. The stress concentration factor at the tip of a 2 millimeter pit can exceed 3. For a main reservoir at 130 PSI, this means the local hoop stress at the pit can surpass 36,000 PSI right at the yield strength of ASTM A36 carbon steel. Ultrasonic thickness gauging is the only reliable method for detecting this kind of hidden wall loss. Visual inspection misses subsurface pits entirely. Even a trained eye cannot see through steel. Ultrasonic probes operating at 2 to 5 MHz can detect thinning within a tenth of a millimeter, but only if the scan grid is dense enough to catch the pit. A single missed spot can leave an undetected threat in service. Maintenance records from multiple ruptures confirm this pattern. Tanks that passed external inspection failed at precisely the point where a deep pit had escaped detection. The Federal Railroad Administration mandates a minimum wall thickness for reservoirs in 130 PSI service. For a 7 mm original wall, any local measurement below 5.6 mm is grounds for immediate removal. This is not a guideline. It is a hard stop. The difference between 5.6 and 7 mm is the difference between a steel balloon and a fragmentation device. Every pit, every micron of wall loss moves the main reservoir closer to pneumatic detonation. The threat is not theoretical. It is measured, documented, and enforced in every serious rupture investigation. As the maintenance chief put it after the 2012 Great Lakes Railway incident, "If you miss the pit, you miss the bomb." A seam split is the main reservoir's first confession. The longitudinal weld that runs the length of the steel balloon is the highest risk seam in any tank that has seen decades of pressure cycles. When the wall thins at the weld, the hoop stress is no longer contained by the original 7 mm of steel. The result is a split, sometimes a clean tear, sometimes a jagged rip, that vents the full charge of compressed air in a single, violent pulse. The ballast beneath the locomotive does not absorb the force. It is blasted aside. Investigative Docket FRA 2019-0831 Documents: a Gulf Coast tank rupture where a bottom seam split at 102 pounds per square inch. Condensate pooling had produced scalloped pitting along the weld. The rupture launched a 150-pound fragment into the third car's brake rigging and drove ballast 9 feet from the track. The pressure trace recorded a 70% drop in less than half a second. Seam splits and bottom shears are classified as Tier 2 hazards. They do not always fragment the reservoir, but they always produce a loss of containment that can compromise the brake pipe, destabilize the train, and injure crew. FRA 2020-0744 details a Pacific Northwest weld split at 118 pounds per square inch. A 30-centimeter crack propagated from the weld toe. The incident displaced 15 feet of ballast and generated a deceleration spike of 0.8 G. Metallurgical analysis found embrittlement in the heat-affected zone from a 2-decade-old repair. Maintenance records showed the last ultrasonic thickness test was 18 months prior, with no anomalies logged. Bottom shears, often triggered by deep condensate pitting, are equally unforgiving. The documented Gulf Coast event measured condensate depth at over a quarter inch. The internal wall was scalloped and thin. When the tank failed, the pressure wave ejected steel and ballast in a pattern typical of a partial detonation. Each docket, FRA 2019-0831, FRA 2020-0744, and FRA 2018-0620, records the same forensic pattern. Hidden decay at the seam, a sudden split, and the violent release of stored pneumatic energy. These are not rare outliers. They are the visible edge of a deeper, fleet-wide threat. The first 5 incidents in the record all show the same evidence: seam splits, bottom shears, and ballast blast signatures. The escalation from split to full fragmentation is not a matter of chance. It is a matter of remaining wall thickness and the silent advance of corrosion. Full fragmentation is the terminal phase of pneumatic reservoir failure. The main reservoir does not merely split, it unzips. The stored energy, measured in megajoules, is transferred instantly to the steel shell. Hoop stress exceeds the yield strength. The wall gives way. The cylinder ruptures in multiple planes, tearing itself into high-velocity fragments. Each piece becomes a projectile. The Gurney equation estimates an average fragment speed of 300 meters per second for a 7 mm wall. A 10-gram shard at this velocity can perforate steel plate, enter the cab, or sever brake pipe fittings. The lethal radius is 3 to 4 meters. This is not a theoretical hazard. It is classified as Tier 1 by the Federal Railroad Administration. The shrapnel pattern is documented in every major catastrophic rupture since 1984. The final 3 cases in the record all meet the criteria for full fragmentation. The 2015 Pacific Northwest incident involved a 140-gallon main reservoir that ruptured at 122 pounds per square inch. The pitting at the bottom of the tank had reduced wall thickness to 4.9 mm. The blast generated fragments that pierced the adjacent brake line and triggered an uncontrolled emergency stop. The 2017 Northern Beltline event involved a defective gauge that misread the reservoir at 95 pounds per square inch, while actual pressure reached 138 pounds per square inch. The tank detonated. A 20-gram steel fragment embedded itself in the rear deck. The crew survived by luck, not by design. The 2022 transcontinental rail disaster involved a 250-gallon reservoir overdue for hydrostatic testing that failed at 127 pounds per square inch. Wall thickness at the point of rupture was 4.5 millimeters. The blast destroyed the brake control console and scattered steel across the ballast. The National Transportation Safety Board metallurgist's statement is blunt. Fragment velocities consistent with high explosive detonation. Failure initiated at the thinnest measured wall, no evidence of overpressure beyond service limits. Each of these events was reconstructed using fragment kinetic energy calculations. The measured overpressure at 1 meter exceeded 6 pounds per square inch. Damage radii matched the predicted blast wave profile. This is not combustion. There is no fireball. The violence comes from the physics of compressed gas expansion. The only barrier between the crew and a fragmentation event is minimum wall thickness, verified by hydrostatic testing. When the steel balloon fails, it does not leak, it detonates. A main reservoir cannot be trusted on faith. Hydrostatic testing is the only accepted proof that a steel balloon will not detonate on the next pressure cycle. The method is simple but unforgiving. First, isolate the reservoir from the brake pipe and vent every trace of compressed air. No shortcuts. Any trapped air pocket can turn a test into a fatal event. The tank is filled completely with water, using the top port, while the bottom drain stays open until all air is expelled. Water is chosen for one reason: it is nearly incompressible. Even at 195 pounds per square inch, the mandated test pressure for a 130 pounds per square inch service tank, the stored energy is minimal. If the steel fails, the water seeps. It does not explode. A calibrated hand pump or a digital hydrostatic rig brings the pressure up to 195 pounds per square inch. The gauge does not lie. The reading must hold steady for 10 minutes. Acceptable decay is less than 0.1 pounds per square inch per minute. Any drop above this, or any visible leak, is immediate grounds for rejection. Inspectors run their hands along every seam and fitting. They look for weeping, bulging, or permanent deformation. If the reservoir expands beyond the original dimensions, the steel has yielded. That tank is condemned. The pressure ratio, 1.5 times service, reflects the real-world margin between survival and detonation. Hydrostatic testing does not just verify containment, it exposes hidden corrosion, failed welds, and the silent advance of condensate pitting. As one Federal Railroad Administration inspector stated, "Water tells the truth, air hides the bomb." Once the test is complete, the tank is drained and dried. Only then is it cleared for ultrasonic inspection and returned to service. No reservoir is exempt. The proof-loading concept is the last defense against a pneumatic detonation beneath the cab. Discipline in this procedure keeps the steel balloon from crossing the line between safety device and shrapnel charge. Ultrasonic thickness gauging is not optional. Every main reservoir released to service must be scanned along its entire circumference with a calibrated probe. The standard is plus or minus 0.1 mm resolution. Any reading below 5.6 mm triggers immediate removal. The grid is dense, 10-degree intervals, with additional passes around weld seams, drain ports, and the bottom sector where condensate pitting is most aggressive. The scan must be logged to the asset record. No gaps, no skipped spots. One missed pit is all it takes for the steel balloon to cross from containment to detonation. Borescope inspection follows the hydrostatic test. A flexible camera enters through the top port and is advanced to the lowest interior point. The operator is looking for pitting, carbon scale, or water film remnants. The lens records every crater, every streak of corrosion, every sign of active decay. Still images and video are archived with the ultrasonic data. If the borescope finds a pit deeper than the minimum wall threshold, the tank is condemned. The inspection is not a formality, it is the last visual defense against hidden rot. Drain maintenance is a live system. Automatic valves must cycle every 30 minutes. Manual drains are tested at each shift change. If the drain fails, water accumulates. Condensate depth above the bottom weld cannot be tolerated. Annual dryer certification is mandatory. The dryer's moisture removal capacity must match the manufacturer's specification. If the dew point rises above minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the desiccant is spent and must be replaced. Relief valves are checked for set point accuracy within 5%. Any drift is cause for replacement. The maintenance cadence is not a checklist. It is the only barrier between stored energy and catastrophic pneumatic rupture. The steel balloon's survival depends on discipline. There are no second chances. Every main reservoir rides the rail as a steel balloon loaded to its engineered ceiling. Condensate pitting undermines minimum wall thickness, bringing pneumatic detonation within inches of the crew. Hydrostatic testing is not just regulation. It is the line between controlled force and lethal fragmentation. This is the reality beneath every locomotive. The margin for error is measured in thousandths of an inch. The pressure never forgives.